Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, my name is Philip Moons. I am Professor of Healthcare and Nursing Science at the University of Leuven in Belgium and the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. I'm happy to address the issue of grant applications with you today. What works and what doesn't. Before I'm starting this web lecture, I want to make something clear. And I would like to use the following quote for this. That states, "Most great people have attained their greatest success just one step beyond their greatest failure." I'm giving this web lecture not because I have been very successful in grant applications, but I have piled up a lot of failures. And I learned from this, and I'm happy to share this with you today. Another expression is this figure. You could think that the road to success is going in a different direction than the road to failure. This is in fact not true. Both the road to success and the road to failure are going in the same direction. It's all about perseverance. Talking about grant applications, there are different approaches. And one approach is what we can call the cookbook approach. We give some ingredients, we give a recipe, and you can go on. And indeed, there are a lot of articles, a lot of guidelines, recommendations that you can use. A very interesting document is this grant proposal checklist. And it really helps you to see what is needed in your proposal. Didn't I forget something? And so on. But you know how it works with cooking. You can use all the ingredients, you can follow the recipe very well, and sometimes it works, but sometimes it's failing as well. And therefore, in this lecture, I'd like to go beyond the cookbook approach. I would like to give you some tips that are going beyond the recommendations that you can read in the different articles if you wish. I would like to give you 10 tips. And the first tip is develop a name and a logo. Some years ago I was attending a seminar given by some successful EU grant applicants. And one of the applicants indicated, and he started his presentation by saying, develop a name and a logo for your project and the rest will follow. This was the most unscientific statement that I heard that afternoon, but to a certain extent I started to understand what this person wanted to say. Indeed, if you develop a name and a logo, you show that you take your project seriously. You show that you are working already from the beginning on visibility of your project. You make sure that you can brand your project, and therefore a name and a logo is important. So you see some examples here. Think about this very seriously. This may be helpful for you. Tip number 2. Know what league you're playing in. Indeed, it is important to know your competitors in the grant proposals. Doing so, or how can you do so? You can read the CVs of these people who were successful in the past year. And to give an example, some years ago I submitted a proposal which was not granted, was not successful, and when I was getting feedback I learned that at that time I had an H index of 20, and I learned that my competitors who were successful in this grant application, that they had an H index of 35. So obviously, and to make the comparison with soccer, I was playing in a local division, they were playing in Champions League. So that is one of the results that I was not playing in the right league. It's also important to know the funding agency. How can you do so? You can read the titles and the subjects of successful grants of the past years. And you can also read in their newsletters what are the things that they are passionate about, what are they highlighting in their newsletter, and then you understand what is really what they think is important. And sometimes you can tweak the objectives of your study a bit towards the objectives of the funding agency. For instance, a funding agency that is very keen on basic science, there you don't have to propose a project on effectiveness of an intervention, because they are more passionate about learning how things work, what is the mechanism of impact. That's more important for them than showing the effectiveness of a certain intervention. So make sure that you know your competitors, make sure that you know the funding agency. Tip number 3, realize that your reviewers are time poor. Indeed, reviewers in general are very busy people, and therefore you need to do everything to make their life easier. To give an example, this is one page of a proposal, and take on average a proposal of 20 pages and take a reviewer who needs to read about 50 proposals, then you understand that this is hard work for them. If you can help them to go more smoothly through your proposal, that will be beneficial for you. And let's have a closer look at this page. You see that certain fragments of the text are put in bold. And if you only read these bold text fragments, in fact, you have the key of the message of the complete page. So by doing so, you are highlighting certain things. If a reviewer would only read the bold fragments, in fact, he or she is already grasping what you want to say. And that's beneficial in the interpretation of your grant proposal. Tip number 4, make your proposal visually attractive. Indeed, look for opportunities for ways to bring in figures, to make a design figure in which you can show very easily what it is all about, to make sure that in a glance that the reviewer understands what you are talking about. That's again a bonus for your proposal. Also, your working plan. Make sure that you have a good Gantt chart or a PERT diagram. There are different ways to do so. And if you do so, that helps you to show what you plan to do, how you will organize the thing, how you will organize the different work packages, what are you asking for in terms of budget, etc. 2 years ago, there was a letter to the editor published in Nature, and the author of this letter argued that we should use multimedia in grant applications. And in the beginning it was a bit strange when I was reading this, but I understood what this author wanted to say. Imagine that you are preparing a grant application and that you can make a YouTube video in which you express the rationale for your study, in which you can interview some key opinion leaders who express the need and the importance of a study like the one that you are proposing. That can be an added value. This is information that you never can get in a research proposal. Therefore, it is worthwhile to consider, I would say. Tip number 5, build a strong consortium. Indeed, reviewers will always think the study that is proposed, is this worthwhile doing? But the reviewers will also wonder, is this researcher or is this research group capable of doing this study? And therefore, including people with a lot of experience, including people with strong CVs in the consortium of your study, increases the credibility of your application. And it's also important to show what work you have been doing in this area before. Because again, this is increasing the credibility. If you have a lot of experience, if you as a researcher or your research group has a lot of experience in this matter, this increases the credibility. How can you do so? One way to do is to make sure that your work is predominantly cited in the reference list of your proposal, and make sure that it is also identifiable like that. And the reviewer sees, okay, this is actually work, previous work where this group is building on, and that please for your application. Tip number 6, ambitious versus feasibility. It's very important that the reviewer understands how substantial the added value is of your newly proposed study. And you can do so by making sure that the reviewer understands what is known, but what is the new knowledge that you will provide, that they understand what is the impact of your study. And it can go in both ways. For instance, if you propose a study in which you will investigate the effectiveness of an intervention, what will be the impact of your study if the intervention has been shown to be effective? But what would be the impact of your study if the intervention is not shown to be effective? And therefore, your study will always be worthwhile to do, even if you have negative study. For instance, one of the arguments that you can use is showing how much money you can save by investigating the effectiveness of a study, and if it is negative, then you are saving a lot of money for healthcare. This is one way to do so. So be ambitious, put your ambitions very high, but make sure that your project is also feasible. Feasible in time, in budget, and in capacities. Certain reviewers really focus on the feasibility of a project. They really want to make sure that if this project is conducted, is this doable? You can be very lofty in your ambitions, but if it is not feasible, they will not grant it. So avoid to downplay your own capacities, but also be very realistic. Tip number 7, take stakeholder involvement seriously. More and more funding agencies really want you to involve patients in the entire process of research. Therefore, how can you do? For instance, you can build up an advisory board. An advisory board in which you include patients, family members, spouses, parents, you can name it, but to make sure that when you are proposing a certain study, that this has been checked with the key stakeholders, being the patient and the family members, and that you can guarantee that it is worthwhile to do so. Another way to involve patients is by having patient research partners. Patient research partners are patients who are integrated in the research team from the very beginning. When you are writing your proposal, you involve them. They can give you indications on what is feasible in terms of assessment, what are primary outcomes that matters to patients, etc. They follow you and they follow the entire research process during data collection, also during analysis. They want to make sure, and they will make sure, that you keep on track and that you make sure that what is important to patients, that is something that is included in your study. It's also a very wise thing to include patient organizations. They quite often, and in many countries, have the voice to policy makers. They make sure that what you are investigating is put on the political agenda. In terms, for instance, of permanent implementation after your research has been done, patient organizations are critical members of society. Tip number 8. Definitions and objectives. Indeed, make sure that the definitions, that the key concepts that you are using in your study, that they are clear and defined from the beginning. Again, I experienced it one time that the definition of what I plan to investigate was mentioned somewhere in the proposal, but the reviewer said, well, I started with reading the proposal and didn't know precisely what I was talking about, and I lost that reviewer. So make sure that you define it from the beginning, that people know what you are talking about. Don't be afraid to use terms that are in vogue or terms that are high on the agenda, because by doing so you make sure that you are increasing the relevance of your study, and sometimes it helps you to make sure that reviewers understand why it is that important that they invest in the study that you propose. I heard one day an investigator saying objectives need to be laser sharp. And indeed, the more concrete you can define and describe your objectives, the better people understand what you're aiming for. Sometimes even reviewers say, what is your hypothesis? And even in a study of which we think that we cannot really form a hypothesis because we don't have prior studies. It's more hypothesis generating studies. It's more exploratory. Try to find a hypothesis, because some people really think that if there is no hypothesis, it's no research, and you're out on beforehand. Tip number 9, equality and diversity. In some countries, in some cultures, there is a high sensitivity in terms of equality and diversity. And this has to do with both the patients to be included and the research group. Make sure that your research group is pretty balanced in terms of gender, in terms of age, that you have younger, junior researchers and more established researchers, that you have people that are early in their career, people that are late in their career, with all their experience. And in some countries, even ethnicity is a very important and a very sensitive issue. So, thinking about your research group, think about equality and diversity as well. Thinking about patients, it's the same. And sometimes it's important that you give specific attention to disadvantaged groups, and by doing so you are increasing the relevance of your study and the importance of your study, and you show that you take equality and diversity very serious. Tip number 10, this is some don'ts, certain things that you should not do. For instance, never use the argument, this study has not been conducted in patients with this condition. Because the question that the reviewer then will ask is, why should we do so? The same with the other don't. Never use the argument, this study has never been done in your country. For instance, this study has never been conducted in Belgium. A reviewer say, yeah, why should we worry? Do we think that we need to do every single study in every single country? Again, the answer is no. So you're out before you're starting. So don't do this, don't use this as an argument. A third don't is don't neglect the impact of negative results of your study. I already mentioned that before. Make sure that you are prepared for negative results, and make sure that even in that case the reviewer understands that it was worthwhile investing in. Even if the results are negative, we learned something and we benefit from these negative findings. And there are always arguments to give. And finally, my last argument is don't give up, because you learned in this web lecture that the road to success is going in the same direction as the road to failure. I wish you good luck with all the grant applications that you will submit in the future.